You remember Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937, right? Well, 4 years earlier, Betty Boop had her own version, and it couldn't be more different. This 1933 short is only 8 minutes long, but it's packed with strange imagery, a jazz soundtrack from Cab Calloway, and some of the boldest animation Fleischer Studios ever produced. It was also one of the last Betty Boop cartoons created before the censors tightened the rules on her risque content. Now, let's take a closer look. Fantasy, sci-fi, nostalgia, reruns of it. Betty Boop and Snow White, 1933, Fleischer Studios. By 1933, Betty Boop was a star. Max and Dave Fleischer had created her as a side character, but she quickly became their biggest draw. Released by Fleischer Studios at the height of Betty Boop's popularity, the Fleischers were the edgy alternative to Disney. Unlike Mickey Mouse, Betty was very much a product of the jazz age, playful, flirtatious, and very adult in tone. This was also the last year before the strict enforcement of the Hays Code, which would force cartoons to become more wholesome. In other words, Snow White was one of the last Betty Boop cartoons that could be truly experimental. What makes this version of Snow White so unforgettable is the music. The Fleischers collaborated with jazz legend Cab Calloway, whose band was one of the hottest acts in Harlem at the time. Calloway didn't just lend his voice, his dance moves were rotoscoped, meaning the animators traced over live action film to create Coco the Clown's spectral movements. Watching Coco glide and sway like Calloway is hypnotic, and when he launches into St. James' Infirmary Blues, the cartoon transforms into a jazz opera. It gave the cartoon a raw urban energy. The imagery is pure surrealism. Figures stretch, melt, and morph. Landscapes twist in impossible ways, and the queen transforms into a dragon-like monster. Every frame feels unstable, as if the world itself is shifting beneath your feet. This was no accident. Fleischer animators were encouraged to experiment, and rotoscoping allowed them to achieve a kind of dreamlike realism that stood apart from everything else. Audiences in the early 1930s were still in the depths of the Great Depression. Escapism mattered, but unlike Disney shorts, Fleischer cartoons reflected a gritty reality. Urban jazz clubs, adult humor, and surreal weirdness that struggling audiences could relate to. Betty's world wasn't sugar-coated. Fleischer's Snow White captured the tension between fantasy and reality in a way that Disney never would. Snow White was later recognized by the Library of Congress in 1994, when it was added to the National Film Registry as culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. That's the same honor given to works like Casablanca or Citizen Kane. Few cartoons ever achieved that status, which shows just how much of a landmark this short is. This wasn't the only time the Fleischers used Cab Calloway. They also appeared in Minnie the Moocher in 1932 and The Old Man of the Mountain in 1933. But Snow White is the one most people think of as the masterpiece. Animation historian Leonard Maltin once called Snow White the best Betty Boop cartoon ever made. It's the perfect mix of music, animation, and personality. Cab Calloway's dance moves were a technical innovation. Rotoscoping would later become a standard technique in both animation and film. Underground animators like Ralph Bakshi were heavily inspired by Snow White. Bakshi called it one of the most daring and surreal pieces of animation ever created. 4 years later, Disney's Snow White would become the first full-length animated feature, sweeping away the competition. But the Fleischers got there first with their twisted little fairy tale. Watching Snow White today, it feels surprisingly modern. Its imagery wouldn't look out of place in a music video or an avant-garde short. The music, of course, is timeless. Cab Calloway's performance still gives chills. And Betty? Well, she's a reminder of a past time when animation wasn't afraid to flirt with adult themes. If anything, Snow White is a time capsule from a moment before animation was sanitized. A moment when it could still be edgy, strange, and haunting, not homogenized or computerized. So while Disney's Snow White gets all the glory, Betty Boop's Snow White deserves its own place in history. It might just be the most unforgettable 8 minutes of animation ever produced. So the next time you hear someone say early cartoons were boring, or just for kids, point them to Betty Boop and Snow White, because once you've seen Cab Calloway's ghostly dance in rotoscope, you'll never forget it. I'll leave a link to the short in the description below, and if you want to see more info about Betty Boop, click the link at the end. This is Rich from Rerun Zone, signing off.